Hello and welcome to the Anishinaabe History Podcast. I'm Chris Waite. Michilimackinac Island is a historically important place to Anishinaabe people. Michilimackinac translates into English as Great Turtle.
Michilimackinac.
There is another translation which comes from the Bureau of American Ethnology, a book printed in 1912. Quote, Michilimackinac, Michilimackinac, place of the big wounded person, or place of the big lame person, a name applied at various times to Mackinac Island in Mackinac County, Michigan, to the village on this island, to the village and fort at Point St. Ignace on the opposite mainland, and at an early period to a considerable extent of territory in the upper part of the lower peninsula of Michigan. It is derived from the name of a supposed extinct tribe, Michilimackinac or Michilimackinac. According to Indian tradition and the Jesuit missions, the Michilimackinac formerly had their headquarters at Mackinac Island and occupied all the adjacent territory in Michigan. They are said to have been at one time numerous and to have had 30 villages, but in retaliation for an invasion of the Mohawk country, they were destroyed by the Iroquois. This must have occurred previous to the occupancy of the country by the Chippewa on their first appearance in this region. A few were still there in 1671, but in Charlevoix's time, 1744, none of them remained. When the Chippewa appeared in this section, they made Michilimackinac Island one of their chief centers, and it retained its importance for a long period. In 1761, their village was said to contain 100 warriors. In 1827, the Catholic part of the inhabitants, to the number of 150, separated from the others and formed a new village near the old one. When the Hurons were driven west by the Iroquois, they settled on Mackinac Island, where they built a village sometime after 1650. Soon thereafter, they removed to the Noquet Islands in Green Bay, but returned about 1670 and settled in a new village on the adjacent mainland, where the Jesuits had just established the mission of St. Ignace. After this, the Hurons settled near the mission. The fugitive Ottawa also settled in the village on the island where the Nouvelle established the mission of St. Francis Borgia among them in 1677. And when the Hurons removed to Detroit, about 1702, the Ottawa and Chippewa continued to live at Michilimackinac. End quote. I believe that Michilimackinac means great turtle and not wounded person, on the basis that the word Mackinac means turtle, and the prefix Michi is usually attached to a word to imply something big. For example, we say Misabe to mean giant or big man. Michipishu is usually translated as underwater lion or underwater panther, but it really means big cat. Michipishu is a legendary big cat-like creature that lives underwater. Therefore, Michilimackinac is great turtle, and Michilimackinac is a dialectical way of saying that. Michilimackinac Island is situated between Lake Huron and Lake Michigan. In the 1600s, French explorers and missionaries were establishing footholds amongst the Michilimackinac Anishinaabe people such as the Ojibwe and Odawa. French forces built a fort and a Jesuit mission at the nearby Straits of Mackinac in 1715. British forces took control of the fort in 1761. That was after the British victory over the French during the French and Indian War. The war is called that because the natives were allied with the French. In 1763, the King of England made his royal proclamation. The king had proclaimed that lands west of Appalachia were for the Indians, and that the colonists could only do business with Britain. Fort Michilimackinac was captured in that same year by the Michilimackinac Ojibway as part of Pontiac's rebellion, but that occupation didn't last long. The fort was returned to the British the next year. When the British colonies in America declared their independence from British rule in 1776, the island and the Ojibwe people there became important to the British. During the American War of Independence, the Ojibwe and Odawa people of Michilimackinac were allies to the British. The Canadian Encyclopedia Online states the following, quote, Lieutenant Governor and Superintendent of Michilimackinac, Patrick Sinclair, arrived in 1779. He quickly began plans to move the British to a more defensible position. After his arrival, Sinclair, along with a mason, carpenter, brickmaker, and farmer, surveyed Mackinac Island. Here they located a good harbor, which Sinclair named Haldimand Bay. The harbor was defensible. A fortification could be built on the overlooking bluff. The harbor also contained all the necessities to build a new fort and village: wood, stone, clay, and some arable land. End quote. Prior to the building of the fort, the British requested the permission of the Anishinaabe people on the island. Quote, Before undertaking any land clearance or construction, the Lieutenant Governor needed Anishinaabe permission. Sinclair planned to construct a wharf and village on Haldimand Bay at the south end of the island. The Anishinaabe had used that place as a gathering place for generations. Additionally, the bluffs where he sought to create a fortification held spiritual significance for the Anishinaabe. As such, Sinclair employed Charles Gautier to present wampum to the local Anishinaabe to gain permission to use the island's resources. The chief agreed to allow the British to cut down some bush this winter. Sinclair immediately began clearing lands where he intended to build a fort. End quote. That's according to the Canadian Encyclopedia. Archives at the University of Toronto state that the Michilimackinac Island Treaty arrangements had begun a few years earlier with a request for wood. Quote, In 1778, 8 Anishinaabe council fires of the Upper Michigan Peninsula region responded to the request of their British allies to allow British troops to harvest wood on the island. By 1780, the Anishinaabe allowed the British to construct a stockaded village, permitted farming on the island, and to have lots given to those white people who were married amongst them. In return, the British undertook to cease farming and harvesting wood on the mainland. On the 12th of May 1781, 4 Anishinaabe elders and indigenous witnesses inscribed their totem images on 2 copies of an English title, written in English, which said that they did, on behalf of themselves and their posterity, renounces all claims in future to the island of Michilimackinac for a consideration of £5,000 New York currency, delivered in goods. The text acknowledges that the Anishinaabe parties agreed that they had signed 2 copies in front of witnesses, one of which deeds is to remain with the Governor of Canada and the other is to remain at this post to certify the same. In addition, the deed states that the Ogamag promised to preserve in our village a belt of wampum of 7 feet in length to perpetuate, secure, and be a lasting memorial of the said transaction to our nation forever hereafter. The agreement lasted until 1796, when the British handed over the island to the United States following the terms of the Jay Treaty and relocated to St. Joseph's Island. 2 copies of the deed exist. The wampum belt's location is at present unknown. End quote. The Canadian Encyclopedia fills in some gaps with the following information. Quote, The agreement with the Anishinaabe only involved clearing brush. Despite Sinclair considering the original agreement complete, the Lieutenant Governor needed to secure a more formal recognition of Mackinac Island's occupation. According to regional historian Stanley Newton, the Anishinaabe believed that Sinclair had violated the original agreement and they contested the island's occupation and threatened British troops in 1780. By spring 1781, Sinclair and the Anishinaabe managed to come to an agreement over Mackinac Island. After gathering a treaty council, according to the instructions in the 1763 Royal Proclamation, Sinclair secured Anishinaabe consent to surrender or deed the island to Great Britain. To confirm the agreement, Sinclair presented the Anishinaabe chiefs with a 7-foot wampum belt to commemorate the surrender, as well as 2 identical deeds. Chiefs Kitchinigon, Poanas, Kusi, and Magusahegan accepted the wampum and signed both deeds with their totemic marks. Sinclair, John Mompesser, R.B. Brooke, and John Robert McDougall signed on behalf of the British military and king. Matthew Leslie, David Rankin, Henry Bostwick, Benjamin Lyon, Etienne Campion, and Pierre-Antoine Tabot signed as settler witnesses. Finally, the loss of Fort Mackinac and the island under the terms of the Treaty of Paris 1783 and subsequent 1794 Jay's Treaty forced the British to look for a new strategic location in the Upper Great Lakes. They eventually settled on St. Joseph Island in Lake Huron in 1796. End quote. Apparently, the University of Michigan has the original deed signed by the British and the Michilimackinac chiefs. A digital copy can be viewed online. The deed says the following, quote, "By these presents, we the following chiefs Kitchinigon, or Grand Sable Poanas, Kusi, and Magusahegan, on behalf of ourselves and all others of our nation, the Chippewas, who have or can lay claim to the herein mentioned island, as being their representatives and chiefs by and with mutual consent, do surrender and yield up into the hands of Lieutenant Governor Sinclair for the behalf and use of His Majesty George III of Great Britain, France and Ireland, King, Defender of the Faith, etc., 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 his heirs, executors, administrators forever, the island of Michilimackinac, or as it is called by the Canadians, La Grosse Isle, situate in that strait which joins the lakes Huron and Michigan, and we do hereby make for ourselves and posterity a renunciation of all claims in future to said island. We also acknowledge to have received, by command of His Excellency Frederick Haldimand Esquire, Governor of the Province of Quebec, General and Commander-in-Chief of all His Majesty's forces in Canada, etc., 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 from the said Lieutenant Governor Sinclair on His Majesty's behalf, the sum of £5,000 New York currency, being the adequate and complete value of the before-mentioned island of Michilimackinac, and have signed 2 deeds of this tenor and date in the presence of Matthew Leslie, John McNamara, David Rankin, Henry Bostwick, Benjamin Lyons, Etienne Campion, and P. Ant Tabot, the underwritten witnesses, one of which deeds is to remain with the Governor of Canada, and the other is to remain at the post to certify the same. And we promise to preserve in our village a belt of wampum of 7 feet in length to perpetuate, secure, and be a lasting memorial of the said transaction to our nation forever hereafter, and that no defect in the deed from want of law forms or any other shall invalidate the same. In witness whereof, we the above-mentioned chiefs do set our hands and seals this 12th day of May, in the year of our Lord 1781, and the 21st year of His Majesty's reign." End quote. Over the next 150 years, the Anishinaabe people around the Great Lakes and Hudson Bay watershed, across the prairies and into the Rocky Mountains, would sign about 94 treaties with Britain, America, and Canada. What is each treaty about? That's all for today's episode. Stay tuned for more episodes in the future. I'm Chris Waite, and this has been the Anishinaabe History Podcast.